Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar on evaluating the quality of real-world evidence. This webinar is co-hosted by the National Health Council and Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy as part of our joint educational series, An Introduction to Real-World Data and Real-World Evidence, a virtual training series for the patient community. My name is Elisabeth Oehrlein, and I'll be moderating today's session. Next slide, please. The National Health Council is made up of over 140 diverse organizations that are brought together to forge consensus and drive patient-centered health policy. And here you see the logos of our voluntary health agencies or patient advocacy organizations that make up the majority of our membership and are really the intended audience of this series, but we're really happy to have all folks joining us who are interested in learning about real-world evidence and real-world data. Next slide, please. And before we get started, I wanted to just go over a couple of housekeeping items. The first is a commonly asked question is, yes, this webinar will be recorded. It'll be archived on our website alongside all of the other webinars in this series. And you'll be able to find the recording at the same location where you registered. All participants are automatically muted, and we will have time at the end for Q&A. Feel free to please submit any questions through the Q&A function, and we will take those at the end. Next slide. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is part of our PCORI-funded training series for the patient community on real-world data and real-world evidence. We really want to thank PCORI for their support, as well as for our advisory board member support. And you'll note that 2 of our speakers today are on our advisory board. So we're really thankful for their work on planning the trainings, but also contributions today. Next slide. And here you can see just an overview of prior webinars in this series. As I mentioned, all of them are available on our website, and so you can take a look at any of them. We're starting to also put up corresponding blogs about them. So if you wanted to read instead of watching the series, you can also do that. And then in addition, I wanted to call attention to our upcoming webinar, which will be on the very timely topic, real-world data and the COVID-19 pandemic. It'll be moderated by Dr. Jillian Sanders-Schmidler, who's the Deputy Director at Duke Margolis and our partner on this project. And it'll be featuring Dr. Blythe Adamson, who's at Flatiron Health and at University of Washington. And she's been really staying on top and involved in real-world data and the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're very excited for that. Next slide, please. All right, so let's jump right into today's topic. And I'd like to start with just some introductions, and then I will turn it over to my colleagues, Dr. Graff and Dr. Orsini. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Graff at the National Pharmaceutical Council. She's the Vice President of Policy Research, and in this role, she leads research and policy initiatives to advance the use of evidence to inform healthcare decision-making. Her focus includes research and education to support increased access to and use of high-quality data, development and adoption of good research methods and policies to enable the exchange of truthful and non-misleading information to support stakeholders' decision-making. We also have Dr. Lucinda Orsini, who currently serves as Vice President, Value and Outcomes Research at Compass Pathways. And prior to her current role, she served as Associate Chief Science Officer at ISPOR, which is the leading society for health economics and outcomes research. She holds a professional medical degree, but she spent most of her career in health economics and outcomes research. And so certainly this has been a big focus of her work and continues to be. So we're really excited to have both of you joining us. And to start, I'd like to turn it over to Jen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Elisabeth. This is really exciting to be here with all of you today. It was about 2 years ago that we published a paper with National Health Council talking about the needs for real-world data and real-world evidence for the patient and patient community. And number 1 was education. So it's always lovely when you hear something that needs to be done and then you see it put into practice. Next slide. I want to talk about what one of the key things that we learned from that work was. First, patients and patient advocacy groups were really surprised RWE, or real world evidence, drawing from routine healthcare data, wasn't routinely available. In our personal lives, you may want to be checking out which of the chocolate boxes get the best reviews at the right prices. We want to be able to compare experiences. In the before COVID times, we often used real-time data to find out when we would get to work, depending on how much traffic there was. Patients, we want to know when that might happen and when we might expect improvements in health, etc. The third area that we heard most resonated is, what do you do next? Now, with our book choices, we might find out, if you like this book, here's some other books that you might also enjoy. We don't have that for our healthcare experience. And so how can we do this? Well, one of the hopes and promises, next slide, is around real world evidence. You've heard in prior webinar series the potential opportunities. It has more diverse patient population, so they might look more like you than a traditional clinical trial. It includes everyday physicians, not just academic centers or the best centers of excellence. It often can include outcomes that may matter more to you, such as function, ability to walk, things that may not be measured outside of a clinical setting. And as we've seen with COVID, they can be done more quickly. But as we see in the next slide, there are many limitations as well. In the real world, it is messy. There's many reasons that treatment decisions may be made. Patients have more complex clinical conditions, and so they may look quite different from a clinical trial. And because this is messy, you can have very different groups that you are comparing. So what is it that we need to do? Next slide. I want to outline 5 key steps that we often take as we're evaluating studies. Now, many of these are things that you may want to think about for evaluating any study. Real-world evidence studies are no different. And I'm going to walk through each of these steps and outline what's different or unique about real-world evidence. But for those of you that are looking to see, hey, here's a new study. Should my patient population, should my membership know about this? Well, first of all, identify the problem and what the need is. Second, talk about whether it's relevant to the problem. 3, think about the data. 4, think about the methods and whether they're credible or not. And then 5th, put it into context. So let's dig into this a bit further. Next slide. Often when we think about evidence, we need to figure out what's the problem we're trying to solve for. So for those of you that are used to Mad Libs, here's a bit of a Mad Lib for you. What are the ... comparative benefits and risks, whatever it is that you're looking for, of a treatment versus what you're interested in comparing it to, and figuring out among whom? So for instance, if I'm interested in learning about what are the comparative benefits, how often do I need to use my rescue inhaler if I've had COVID or not, among patients treated in usual care settings, is a specific question that you can ask. But making sure you identify that question is really important, because as we see in the next slide, there are no right answers to the wrong questions. If we ask the wrong question, we aren't going to get something that's useful. And given the amount of literature that's out there, and for those of you that can go into a Google search, you can go down a rabbit hole very quickly. So we want to make sure we ask the right question. Then once you have that question, figure out, is it relevant to your problem? For instance, we often use something called a PCOS. And you can outline, is the population relevant? For instance, if the real world data draws from Medicare claims population, and your membership is mainly in their 20s, it may not be as relevant as something that includes patients that look more like your membership and patient population. Are the interventions and comparisons similar to your care? Sometimes we see outside the US, there's different doses that are available. And so comparisons for those interventions or comparators may be different. Are the key outcomes relevant? Is the time horizon relevant? And is the setting? Because we know if you wanted to look at real world data done in Germany versus in the US, treatment patterns for diabetes are quite different. So they may not be relevant. Ideally, you would want all of these to be incredibly relevant. And yes, if they're all no, you probably don't want to look at that study and you can move on. And that leads us to the third step, which once you have your set of studies that you want to look at, you want to look and as you're reading through the study, determine if the data is high quality. Now, why does this matter? In randomized controlled trials, there's a careful case report form. It's all collected specifically for the randomized controlled trial. But in real world data, data collected for routine patient care, it may be being collected for claims or billing information. It may not be as complete. It might only include hospital outpatient records and not things from outside physicians that may not be part of a network. And we all have been there where you've seen things that don't quite look right, where all of a sudden a huge tick up occurs in the prevalence of a disease. And when you realize, wait, did something happen? Oh, it had to do with the way that codes and healthcare is paid for changed. And that changed what was coded and put forward in health insurance information. Now, this is a really hard thing to do. When you're reading studies, it's hard to tell if the data is high quality or not. But there should be a section in the discussion or maybe in the methods discussing what the researchers did to make sure that the data conforms to what they expected it to look like, that it's complete, and that the data is plausible because it undergoes a lot of transformations. And I think Dr. Orsini will speak about this as well as she talks about transparency. So once you know the data is good, because you can't conduct good research if there is not good data, you need to figure out if the methods that they used are high quality as well. So that leads us to step 4. And this is the most complicated issue. So I've broken it out into 4 areas. First, are the outcomes credible? Is the exposure or treatment valid? Are the comparisons fair? And is there confounding? So let me walk through that a little bit more because this is the bulk of the challenges for RWE. Next slide. So we're all in February. You've likely given up your exercise campaigns already that you've started in 2021. But this cartoon fits a lot for me. Exercising builds muscle. Muscle makes you want to show off your body. To show off your body, you need a tan. Tanning turns your skin to leather. Cows are made of leather. Cows are fat. Therefore, exercise makes you fat. That's an extreme, but we have seen things where sometimes the outcomes used and the claims made with the studies don't match. So let's give an example. Real world data using health insurance claims that's looking at a mortality endpoint or death may be a little more hard to see because death is not commonly recorded in health insurance claims. That's cheap. It doesn't cost anything. So instead, the researchers, if they're looking at cardiovascular death, for instance, they would need to look at a heart attack with certain codes and procedures, followed by potentially immediate disenrollment from the health insurance plan. Or they might want to link it to death indexes that come from from CMS. It happens not only for death, but for other outcomes. Can you actually characterize the outcome of interest? If you're interested in asthma attacks, is that always going to be recorded in an ER or in a hospital setting or urgent care? Sometimes not, and you may need that from patients and others. So that's on the outcome side. On the exposure, and when I say exposure, I'm really talking about, can you measure where someone actually took it? So we've all seen things where you might prescribe something, but because of the cost or the complications, patients never go and pick up the medication. Do you know that that there was exposure to that treatment or to that intervention? Similar with diet and exercise. How certain are you that the recording of diet and exercise, if you're comparing two different diets, is a high quality exposure. Is it a daily log? Is it a weekly look back, etc.? So that covers the first part. The second part is the part that's really challenging because of the messiness of real world data. Next slide. And this is confounding. Now, confounding, there's bias in confounding, and there's many reasons for confounding. I usually think of confounding as the and what else? Under what circumstances could some other factor change the outcomes? So there's confounding by indication. So if we're talking about COVID and you were to look at patients that received monoclonal antibodies versus those that did not, you might think, oh, those that have more severe comorbidities, older in age, are more likely to get the monoclonal antibodies than those that did not. And so how do you ensure that those comparisons, if you were comparing patients who received a monoclonal antibody and those that did not, have similar patient groups, maybe confounding by indication? Sometimes there's other things like how far it is to get to the hospital, insurance status, etc. And so the three things that you'll want to look for: do the researchers talk about how they design the study to to reduce confounding? Did they talk about analytical methods to reduce confounding, and what else? And do they conduct sensitivity analyses? It's hard to get rid of all confounding, and there's always, quote, unknown unknowns. But careful design and analysis and sensitivity analysis and acknowledgement in the limitations are important as we move forward. So that leads us to the last part, which is putting this into context. Next slide. Like any other type of evidence, if real-world evidence is not in context with the body of evidence, all of the other studies, what you know, you should be really thoughtful about it. Does it make sense? Does it go in a different direction? Does it improve your certainty or not? And so these are the 5 things that we can do. Now, if you want to learn more, next slide, just in January, we published a paper with the University of Washington in the Journal of Managed Care and Specialty Pharmacy, evaluating 5 different RWE evaluation tools. And one of them, including the CER Collaborative, which is here on the screen now, is one we did with ISPOR as well. These were designed for clinical or reviewers and others to better understand what to look for with real-world evidence. They can be used by patient groups as well, but they give you that next level of detail that you need. So in summary, on the next slide, I want to outline, we talked about 5 things. First, figure out the type of evidence you need. Determine if the study is relevant. Look at the data. Is it high quality? Do they use good methods? And then put it into context. These are the 5 things that we can do with real-world evidence as well as all the other studies. But to do that, you really need to understand what is included in those studies. And that's why some of the work that Dr. Orsini has been leading is so critically important. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Orsini.
Thanks, Dr. Graff. So that's really important lead-in, I think, to what I'm going to talk about with transparency and real-world evidence. All of those, understanding exactly all of those features of a study is really important to make a decision about how that study could be used to help make decisions. You can go to the next slide. So why is transparency important, especially for real-world evidence? I mean, I think we're used to going to a site like clinicaltrials.gov if you're interested to figure out what clinical trials have been are posted, are ongoing, where they are in the study process. All of that is pretty typical, of information available for a clinical trial, but there really isn't a place for real-world evidence studies in that same way. And the reason clinicaltrials.gov is so important is because it does provide a level of transparency and a way to sort of track versioning over time, and eventually even a place to post results all in one place. So it's easy to find the studies and maybe even put them into context of what else is being done. But for real world evidence, that's not always the case. And we know, Dr. Graff mentioned real world evidence is very messy. It's based on data collected for other purposes, either healthcare claims data, that's for insurance billing, electronic health records, which is a record your doctor keeps for you when they see you in the doctor's office, or even registry data, which might be analyzed for different purposes than it was originally collected. When you plan to do a study with these data, you often have all of the data in a database. It's there, it's collected. We're often looking at it in a retrospective fashion, meaning that it's all there collected over a sequential amount of time, but we're going to go back and analyze it now. And when you have data in hand, there's the perception that you can take the data and manipulate it and analyze it in many different ways until it tells the story that you want it to tell, sometimes torturing the data till it confesses. So if you have an idea, if a researcher has an idea of a hypothesis that they're trying to prove or disprove, can they then go into the data they already have and figure out the right way to analyze and report it so that it looks like a positive outcome for their hypothesis. So that's a perception and something we have to be really aware of when we're thinking about real world evidence. And end users, like Dr. Graff was saying, they really want to understand the quality of the study. In order to go through those 5 steps, you need to understand what the research question was, what the objective of the study was, what the analysis plan looked like, how it might have changed over time, and then how the results look, and then hopefully have access to other similar types of studies, be they clinical trials or other real world evidence, to try to put it all into context. So we want to trust a study, but in order to trust it, we need to verify. And we also need to compare the results at the end so that we have a better understanding of how that data might compare to other studies, similar studies, or if it's different from results from another study that's similar, why, so that you can understand, was it the way the study was done? Was it the patient population? Was it some other reason? You can move to the next slide. So I want to spend a little bit of time, though, talking about the difference between transparency versus quality. So really our intention, or we hope, is that over time, the uptake and usage of real-world evidence for healthcare decision-making is increasing. At the end, users have confidence that the results of the study that they have in front of them actually could help them make the decision that they have at hand. But in order to do that, the end user needs to be able to assess the quality of the study in order to gain that confidence. And the best way to assess quality is to have as much information about the study conduct as possible. So as you can see from the schematic, which I borrowed from Shirley Wang at Harvard University, high transparency does not equal or ensure quality. But at the outset, if you have a transparent study in front of you, it at least allows the end user a better chance at assessing the quality. And over time, by encouraging the researchers to have this culture of transparency, the researchers themselves start to think a little bit more critically about their study before they even develop them. And the end users also then develop confidence in this type of research and their ability to decide which real world evidence studies they can have confidence in and use to inform decision making. You can go to the next slide. So really, I want to make a little distinction here because real world evidence could be done prospectively. You could collect data just like you do with a clinical trial over time and analyze it at the end. Many patient registries are like this. But this particular issue we're talking here is about secondary data use. And that, again, goes back to using data for research purposes when that's not the original intent of the data. So there are issues and questions always around the underlying data quality, as as Dr. Graff was mentioning. That's really an important question and one that an end user has to think about. You have to understand that there's perceptions of what we call data dredging, or p-hacking, or cherry picking. So are you doing as many analyses of the data as possible to come up with the result that you want? Are you adjusting the analysis a little bit so that you can get that 0.05 significant, or your confidence intervals are not overlapping? Or are you at the end sort of just cherry picking the results that you are most favorable and not showing the rest of the information? It's really hard to do that with a study if people have enough information about what was planned, what was analyzed, and what was supposed to be reported, so that you can really ask all the right questions. And then with the lack of transparency, didn't really understand the actual research questions or the objectives or the data set choice or how they plan the analysis, so that, again, you can have more confidence that the results really reflect the intention of the study that from its outset. We also know that there's a lack of reporting for these types of studies, which also decreases the visibility into the universe of the studies conducted and their associated results. Often, peer review publications are not quite as interested in publishing these types of real world evidence studies at the same rate as a clinical trial. A study that has negative results or not proving the hypothesis often is not put up for a publication. And this really creates a blind spot for assessing comparative effectiveness, where you and putting things into context, where you really need the totality of evidence to understand what's been done in a certain disease area. Next slide. The other thing I want to point out is what we're calling hypothesis evaluating treatment effect studies. This is really a reference to studies that are looking at comparative effectiveness. You're comparing service A to service B, drug C to drug D. You really want to understand how two different medical technologies or medical services are performing against each other, so you can help make a decision about what's right for you to do, either with your patients or for yourself, or maybe even at the macro level, at a health system. So often these types of studies are really intended for regulatory, payer, or other decision making, and they're often going to peer review publication. They're really evaluating the presence or absence of a pre-specified treatment effect and how big that effect might be. And they're testing a hypothesis in a specific data set. And it's often in conjunction with other evidence used to think about making treatment recommendations. Now, there are types of real world evidence studies where you're just trying to understand the underlying patient population, what comorbidities they might have, or is this the right data set for me even to use to try to answer this question that I have at hand? Those types of studies aren't necessarily testing a comparative effectiveness question, and they might be, they certainly have a little bit more flexibility in trying to look around within the data to understand the data set itself, or how to eventually design a study for comparative effectiveness. So there is a slight difference there. I just wanted to point out that nuance, that where we're talking about transparency, when you're really trying to make a decision, you're looking at these hypothesis evaluating studies or comparative effectiveness. You can go to the next slide. So ISPOR, in collaboration with Duke Margolis for Health Policy, they're part of one of our partners, MPC, so Jennifer Graff is well aware of this work. We formed this initiative with the steering committees, the authors of these papers that were published synchronously in both Value in Health and PDS back in September, really giving recommendations around how can we improve transparency and build trust in real world, and again, that secondary data study for hypothesis testing for comparative effectiveness. You can go to the next slide where I pulled out some of the recommendations. So this is the recommendations that come from that paper. Really, we want to make sure that there are places to register these types of studies. So again, going back to my original comments, the clinicaltrials.gov for real world evidence studies, we probably are ready for something like that, which then encourages people to think proactively about their study, putting together all of those pieces that need to be in place around the methodology and the analysis planning before you get too deep into actually analyzing the data, because of that perception around data dredging that's possible there. If you register the study ahead of time, it's date stamped, it's timed, people can go there and find it. So we're really trying to encourage a move for real world evidence researchers to move towards actually registering their studies in that way. We're also trying to figure out the best characteristics for a good registration site for these types of studies, because it's not very easy for them to be registered in a clinical trial registration site where they're looking at first patient, first visit, and these types of things, which just don't make a lot of sense for these types of studies where the data is already collected. And then eventually we hope to find ways to provide incentives for routine registration of these hypothesis evaluating treatment effect studies so that people get used to it. The peer reviewers are looking for this pre-registration when a research team comes to them with publication plans or requests for publication, and payers and other health systems can go and say, look, I have a lot of more knowledge about the study itself that I can't just find within the publication. Perhaps the protocols attached, there's a lot more information or underlying understanding of the data, of the methods, of the analytic plan. If something changed over time, I can see the different versions. So all of this leads into that ability to assess quality. And it's not going to happen overnight, but this is something that we're pushing towards with our real world evidence researchers in terms of a shift in thinking about how they do their study planning. You can go to the last slide. So what's the impact of this? So by having people think, having our researchers think more critically, proactively about the study, you'll end users have a better understanding of the research questions, the hypotheses and objectives, analysis plan, the underlying data, and any changes, like I was saying. And at least then you have enough transparency to make a decision about the quality of the study itself and how useful it might be for decision making. And in the long term, because this is also a place where people can come back and post the results, even if it isn't published, we have better access to the totality of evidence in terms of the actual results from these types of studies, which then allow you to do some comparisons with other types of studies and similar studies done with real world evidence in the same patient populations or similar disease areas, so that you can make a decision or have a better understanding where their differences are and why, or you have better comfort in knowing that this is a study that I can use to make a decision. So that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Drs. Graff and Orsini, for your presentations. They were very informative. We've had a number of questions come in, so I will start with the very first question that came in, which is about existing checklists. So how does the GRACE checklist to evaluate real-world evidence quality compare with others? For example, RECORD, STROBE, there may be others. So I'd open that question to both of you.
I can kick it off. So there's a number of different tools. So RECORD was developed to help the reporting of studies, of real world evidence studies. So I often think about RECORD is as when I'm conducting a research study, I go through RECORD to make sure I've included all of the relevant things when I'm writing up that manuscript. GRACE was really, the GRACE checklist and GRACE principles was really designed for when someone gets a study, what should you look for? And so they're very similar in many manners, but they're designed for slightly different use cases.
I don't have anything else to add necessarily. I was thinking about the CER checklist, for example. That was mostly designed to help people walk through a study when they're trying to make a determination about the quality of it and whether they feel like it's useful for their end purposes. So there's sort of different intentions, I would say, with some of these checklists, but often they need to be used maybe together. Sorry.
Yeah, and I would just, we often get this other, just to build on that, which tool should I use? They're all designed for different purposes. Some are, can range from 12 questions to 35 questions to others that are a whole suite of tools. I view it as these are tools that you can use. And if you're ever trying to do something for the first time, my son, as he's learning long division, they have all of these tools and strategies that they use. These are strategies to help you understand how to evaluate these studies. And when I was in pharmacy school, this was not part of our curriculum. So it's an important piece to have a tool. And then as you use it over time, it gets a lot easier because you know what to look for, how to use it, etc.
Absolutely. And we will link to those resources from the main page where the recording will be available. So if those are new to folks, we will make them available, and along with the CER collaborative tool, because I think that's also a really helpful one for folks to be aware of. One other question that came in is with regards to decision making. So the question is, how can we help decision makers understand the value of real world evidence, even though it's not randomized controlled trial data? As you had mentioned, many of the data sources used for real world evidence development were not originally collected for research purposes. And I like this was, we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's value in using real world data. However, it has limits that shouldn't negate it for decision making. So I would turn that over, and I know both of you have been very familiar with kind of the adoption by FDA of real world evidence and other decision makers. Maybe, you know, sort of what needed to happen for those, for that adoption to occur, I think could be helpful. Thanks.
So I can take a stab. So yes, I agree. Real world evidence isn't perfect. I think acknowledging the fact that there's limitations to what can be done with it and how it should be used is really important. I think also when you're looking at a study, making sure that the authors do talk about the limitations of their study and maybe what it shouldn't be used for. And sometimes, you know, they're pretty eloquent in talking about, you know, here's what you could take away from this and what you can't. From a regulatory perspective, we know the FDA has been very deeply involved in using in the several different efforts using real world evidence, trying to replicate clinical trial results so that you can, or so that they can feel more confident that these data with the right study methods and the right setup can really give you the same sort of robust results a clinical trial might do. Now that's a special use case because often we're using real world evidence to answer a question that a clinical trial can't answer. And there's a reason we're using it. So while we take comfort from the fact that you can use real world evidence with the right methods and underlying data quality and setup of the data set to replicate a clinical trial, that's usually not the intention of a real world evidence study. So I think it's just a matter of if you're bringing forward a study that, you know, we're trying to make a decision with, that we're really, again, transparent, but in the sense of this is what we know we can say with this, and this is what we can't or shouldn't try to say with these types of data. And it's a continuum, right? It's not real world evidence replaces clinical trials, but it's used in addition to or in combination with. So I think that's an important point as well.
I would just build on that and take it in a slightly different direction as well. So where are we going? When we spoke with clinical practice guideline groups a few years ago, there wasn't as much real world data use. Now we're starting to see the benefits of using real world data for broader patient populations, and you'll see elements included in a couple of the clinical practice guideline groups that are putting out recommendations. So that's on one side where we're seeing changes and greater recognition that it's important. The second, I would just say, is in health plan and insurance decision making. It used to be, and we've conducted a few studies over the years. About 5 years ago, it was about 4 to 6% of all decisions included real world data. Then about 3 years ago, it was 10%. I think the most recent data is about 16% of evidence used for coverage decision makings includes real world data. So it's growing in its use. The question is it the right use? And is it the right studies? Because it's not just, do you want to use real world data? We want to use real world data when it's high quality data using good methods and high quality data. And so I think those are the couple of elements, but people are starting to see more and more, and the discussions are quite different. And I think they will be even more so as the FDA continues to put out their premature on real world evidence. We'll see other groups picking that up as well.
Thank you. And the next question is, for organizations that have registries, would you consider submission and review of a proposal by the registry project selection committees a mechanism to increase transparency in lieu of having to submit to clinicaltrials.gov. And for clarity, the data would not be released to a researcher for use prior to proposal approval.
I don't know that I have a good answer to that question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question from Angela, and perhaps perhaps this is really something that evolves over time, and that we can continue to have conversations around is really what's appropriate for when. I think one other question in my mind that comes up that's pretty related to Angela's question is with regards to institutional review boards, and what is the role of an institutional review board in terms of evaluating the protocol for a real world database analysis. And oftentimes what we have is that it gets designated that it doesn't actually have to undergo a thorough review, and how does that evolve over time? So I think that there's a lot of outstanding questions in that area, but definitely a topic for us to keep touching on. We only have a couple minutes, so maybe I'll move along to the next question, which is about fit for purpose. So if you could both touch on what does the term fit for purpose mean? Could you speak about how you interpret whether the available real world data are fit for use, fit for purpose in terms of relevance, reliability, and perhaps give a couple of examples?
I can jump in on this one first, and others can add on then. So when I think about fit for use, it's really around fit for this specific question you're trying to answer. So let me give you an example. If you were to look at treatment, compare treatments during COVID pandemic, and the data source did not include telehealth visits, that probably is not complete. And so therefore the data would be less than fit for use. So when I think about the data, I think about, does it conform? Is it complete? And is it realistic and plausible? Do I believe it? So that's an example where it wouldn't be complete. As we think about how things, it also matters on, can you actually capture those outcomes of interest for that question in that database? And I think, or in the registry. And I think those are the couple of things with certainty. And certain things like, how often you felt anxious, unless you had, if you were looking at an anxiety scale, unless you had real-time recording or daily logs, it probably won't be measured to the same extent in a claims data. So it may not be effective or fit for use for certain questions.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that's sometimes why people have to do a lot of, data feasibility and understanding and or even creation of algorithms in order to try to get to an endpoint that does make a lot, does make sense for, or try to capture an endpoint that makes sense to a regulator, but also to patients and in doctors or providers as well, because unless you can get to an endpoint that makes sense in clinical practice as much as it does for a regulatory endpoint, that study isn't very helpful, and those data probably not as useful. So I think that's a really great point.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for presenting today and for all of the work that you're doing also in this space with regards to greater quality measurement and real world data evaluation and transparency. It's really important work, and we're happy to talk about it more and to help get the word out about these resources that exist and processes. So I wanted to thank all of our speakers, and also if you are interested in joining our next webinar, which will get specifically into COVID-19 and how real world data are being used and have been used over the past year with regards to real world data, please register. We have the link here, and feel free to reach out to join our mailing list to stay up to speed on all upcoming topics. But thank you again so much, Doctors Graff and Orsini, and we really appreciate it. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon.